Professor Stiglitz, it is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today at Fundación Rafael del Pino to talk about your book, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy. Thank you and congratulations for this new Spanish edition published by Antonio Bosco.
Thank you.
Professor, your book is an exhaustive set of proposals to modernize the rules of the European economy. You are correctly reminding us that economics is a social science and not a mere set of technical rules. And in your book, you distribute your proposals in 4 blocks. Correct me if I'm wrong. First, how to reform the macroeconomic rules to promote full employment as the ultimate target of stabilization policies. Secondly, how to reform the regulatory framework for companies to guarantee fair competition, a fair risk sharing in the financial sector, and fair taxation, which is crucial. Thirdly, how to reform the welfare state in the European Union to address poverty, inequality, and fair labor conditions for workers. And finally, how to reform the governance of globalization so no one is left behind. Let me start, if you allow me, in those 4 blocks, to start by asking you about the new, let's say, macroeconomic scenario in Europe after the COVID pandemic, which came after the English version was published. By looking at the reaction of the European Union in this crisis, one would think that they have really read your book. Unlike in the past crisis, this time the EU Commission suspended the Stability and Growth Pact rules. The ECB applied its whatever it takes almost immediately. And the EU Council and the Parliament approved the Next Generation EU as an investment instrument, common investment instrument financed with common debt, which is something. Do you think, Professor, that the EU has really learned from its past mistakes, or is this just an illusion, an exception to the rule, and that we will soon see a new wave of austerity, especially if interest rates go up?
Well, I'm hopeful they have learned. And the discussion leading up to the actions suggested that at least most of the countries had learned. But the debate was very intense, and the frugal 4 or 5, as they're called, were hesitant, to put it mildly. At the end, they realized that if Europe was going to survive, they were going to have to issue the Euro bonds. They realized that they could not impose the kind of austerity measures that they had imposed during the Euro crisis. So I'm hopeful. I think, as we say in the United States, the jury is still out. Mm-hmm. But I think I'm hopeful that they won't go back to the kind of austerity that marked 2010, which it was very clear did not serve the interest of Europe as a whole, let alone the interest of the countries that were afflicted with the crisis.
Absolutely. Let's hope that there is not only this common debt, but also a revision of the fiscal pact and the rules, which, as you said in the book, were just not just figures, strange figures, and not necessarily backed by strong reasons. No, you correctly remind us in your book that the Eurozone is a half-baked monetary union, no, where that still lacks many essential instruments and a permanent fiscal capacity for automatic stabilizers and a discretionary investment tools. You make some suggestions in that regard in your book, a common European deposit insurance scheme or a backstop for the Single Resolution Fund. Curiously enough, there is consensus on the need to complete the euro governance, and everybody says that, no? But some countries remain reluctant because probably of the problem of moral hazard that you know so well. Probably moral hazard operates in many times just an excuse not to do anything, but it has also part of truth. No? How do you think, Professor, that the EU can build trust between northern and southern member states to complete the euro, which is urgent, but at the same time avoid transfer going just only in one direction, or make sure that structural reforms needed in some countries, in southern countries mainly, are effectively carried out?
First, let me say, I think the argument of moral hazard has been greatly exaggerated. Mm-hmm. No country, no government wants to have the kind of crisis that Greece or Spain or Ireland faced. They didn't go through these crises in order to get more money from the other countries. Let's be clear about that. In the case of Spain and Ireland, they actually did everything right in terms of the Growth and Stability Pact. They actually had surpluses before the crisis. So you can't blame them in that sense for having violated the basic rules. There is a framework for thinking about how to mitigate these worries, which is to say every country has its normal level of unemployment. When the level of unemployment gets higher than that normal level, then there will be transfers from one country to another. So Spain's normal level of unemployment is higher than, say, Sweden's. And that would mean that the transfers would go one way or the other, depending on the departure of the country from that normal level. Of course, every country will work to get that normal level down. It wants large fractions of their population unemployed. And as that normal level goes down, that the trigger points for the transfers will have to be adjusted.
Absolutely. And to make sure that structural reforms are implemented, do you think that common decisions on the structural reforms are required, or maybe the European semester is at least a better framework that of the Troika, which was totally unexplainable?
I think there needs to be discussion, but I think the experience, particularly during the Euro crisis, was that many of the so-called structural reforms were not really designed to make the economy more efficient. They were special interest reforms. They reflected special, you might say, ideologies, weakening labor unions. I think many people think there should have been work in the opposite direction, strengthening labor unions. Some think that there should have been stronger measures on competition policy. Others argue for national champions. I think there is not enough consensus about some of the key aspects that make for a dynamic economy that one can impose the ideology in one part of Europe on that of another.
Absolutely. And one thing that you mentioned in your book is the fact that there is no easy way back in some fundamental changes of the economy. And economics does not operate symmetrically, and you say that you cannot go back to the 20th century. If you are married and with children, you can divorce, but you cannot go back to bachelorhood. So global value chains have made imported intermediate products essential. Tariffs do not work like they used to be, like we saw it during the Trump trade war. Devaluations, neither, and even the margin of national countries to control interest rates in a world of financial globalization are not the same. They are constrained by financial globalization. So are we really running out of strictly national macroeconomic tools? And do you see that many nationalists in Europe are really aware that there is no way back to a so-called good old days where you could decide on everything, and that we need, and are they aware that we need more integration probably and not less?
Well, within Europe, I think there is a need for more integration, not less. Europe over the last half century or more has succeeded in bringing the countries much closer together. You see it particularly among young people who see their identity as being Europeans. Of course, Europeans are French, Europeans and Italian, Europeans and Spanish, but part of their identity is Europe. And that is, I think, the success of the European project. With respect to global integration, matters are a little bit more complex. Within Europe, there is a common understanding about the importance of democracy, the importance of human rights. There are a couple countries that you might say don't fully share, and the question is, should they be part of Europe? But that's a different question. I'm talking about all but one or two of the countries. Globally, that kind of shared values is not there. And there is increasing discussion, particularly in the United States, about delinking between China and the United States, especially when it comes to to technologies. That's I think, an area of lively debate because given the marked differences in values, the question is, how do you get the advantages of comparative advantage? Mm-hmm. Same time that you're in intense competition for the minds and hearts of those in the third world, in Africa and Latin America, and other places in Asia. And that, I think, is one of the debates that will preoccupy us in the coming decade.
Absolutely, and to keep those values, you must survive also in the hard competition world. Regarding the part of the second block of the regulations that you have already introduced by talking about European champions, it's true that you need the competition environment is changing very quickly. Now the new oil is data, and big data and artificial intelligence are proving to be tremendously useful as a business for big companies to gather information. But curiously enough, most of the use of it's mostly the private sector that benefits from big data and from artificial intelligence, and the one that monetizes it. But do you think that there is room for the public sector to benefit from big data, for instance, for social policies, for even oversee asymmetric information problems in sectors such as insurance or finance? Are they losing the opportunity to use data?
I think there are multiple roles for the public sector in dealing with what you call the new oil, the data. On the one hand, it is a tool which can help improve the overall quality of our healthcare system. It can allow for better targeting of social assistance. It can help us monitor the economy and make sure that we are better able to maintain economic stability, full employment. On the other hand, I think it is very important for a government to take a bigger role than it has in the past in regulating the big tech companies. They have not only enormous economic power, they affect every aspect of our lives, and they have been engaged in the results of their activities has increased inequality inequalities in our society. So, and they've been, you might say, not good players in that there's been an invasion of privacy. They've used their market power in a whole variety of ways, engaged in harms. The debate, the discussion of these big tech has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. At the beginning of this century, we talked about the wonderful benefits they brought. Now we're just so much more aware of also the harms they brought. Harms to individuals, to our society, incitement of violence, racial hatred, political manipulation, anti-vaccine movements, the dissemination of misinformation, and a whole set of actions which I think harm our society. Europe has taken the lead in developing a set of regulations to put these digital giants under control. There is work in the G20 to try to make sure that they are taxed. Mm-hmm. There is leadership, again, from Europe in making sure that they don't abuse their market power. So we are beginning to understand the harms, and we are beginning to understand how public policy can restrain those harms. It's going to take a while, I think, to put them adequately under control. And there will wind up with a variety of instruments that we will have to employ given their power. But let me emphasize that, for instance, when they facilitate discriminatory pricing, which is what they've been doing, mm-hmm. actually undermine the very basis of the efficiency of a market economy. Sure. And when they engage in massive tax avoidance, they impair the ability of the public to raise the revenues necessary for the basic functioning of our society. When they incite the kinds of violence, racial and ethnic violence that they did in Myanmar, like Facebook, over Facebook, mm-hmm. They really divide our societies. So I think it's very clear we passed the point where we can say, oh, let's leave it to them to self-regulate. That was what you heard 20 years ago. We're beyond that point, and I welcome Europe's efforts to try to bring them under control.
Well, you're absolutely right, and maybe in some cases it's an inheritance of the U.S. system, in the sense that provided that consumers are happy, normally companies are left alone or the market power you don't see until it's too late. But it's also important on the part of the providers or on the part of privacy, as you say. It's curious because politicians in Europe are insisting on the need to counteract this power of Google and the big GAFA companies, but also trying to in some cases to create European champions, which is a thorny debate, because I was happy to read your warning that I consider it really appropriate, to saying that European champions, of course, may be useful to balance competition with Chinese companies, or also to have a little way of checks and balances in the world. But at the same time, they can also deteriorate internal competition. How can we develop, Professor, a truly effective international or multilateral competition framework? Because so far competition laws do not operate internationally, and that protects at the same time EU companies and workers from unfair competition, but at the same time protects them from abuse of national market power. Can this be solved? This international, or is the WTO the adequate forum?
Well, I think there is a need for an international competition authority. That with globalization, there are companies that go across borders, and just as in the United States, we have competition authorities at the state level and at the national level. There's overlapping jurisdiction. In the era of globalization, there needs to be regulation, antitrust policy, competition policy at the level, at multiple levels, at the state, national, and supranational level. I think one of the important points for Europe to remember is that actually, in many cases, the best way of competing is to have competition. That the problem with the national champions is that they have so much market power that they don't have to be as dynamic as they would be with more competition. So that in many cases, the idea that we can only win if we have big giants is a false premise, and that you can win with nimble, smaller firms that have, of course, enough size, but they don't have to have the monopoly power that often is associated with less innovation, less dynamic firms.
Absolutely, and it's curious also that these superpowers in technology, Google, Amazon, are also entering other sectors. No, in this regard, you dedicate a big part of one of your chapters to concentrate on the need to regulate the financial sector, which is absolutely necessary. There is always this trend to regulate, overregulate, deregulate, and we have seen the dangers of that. But at the same time, it's true that the financial sector is a sector in very rapid transformation. So maybe the financial sector that we see today, or the banking sector, in a few years will be totally different. No, for instance, when all the TechFin, Google, Amazon, become banks, which they are trying already to ask for licenses for being banks. What do you think that will be the effect? Will that increase competition and benefit consumers, or on the contrary, do you think that this will create even more complex regulatory problems?
Well, it's clearly going to create more complex problems, because they are able to use their data in ways which, on one hand, may lead to better lending,
true,
better who can repay, but they also can use that information to engage in discriminatory lending, to differentiate, to say you're willing to pay a higher interest rate, charge groups that are disadvantaged higher interest rates because their opportunities are less. And we've seen that already in the United States, where in other areas, they use that information to recognize that poor people live in areas where there are fewer stores. And because there are fewer stores, they can raise the price without losing their customers. So these digital giants have engaged, or even not the digital giants, ordinary stores have been using the data in order to engage in racial price discrimination. So this is a major problem that we need to regulate. And as they go from just selling ordinary products, office products, consumer goods, into lending, this could have an amplification effect that would be very, very bad for our society. Moreover, because they have more data, they can outcompete other potential lenders. So it seems to me that what we will have to do is develop a better regulatory system that will prevent the digital giants from using the data that they have to advantage themselves at the expense of the rest of our society. If we're going to maintain a competitive economy, we will have to make sure that either there are restrictions on the use of the data or that the data is provided as part of the commons that everybody can use. So either we say we don't allow that use of that data, or we make sure that the data is more publicly available. But the current framework is, in a way, an interesting contrast to China, whereas in China, they have the surveillance state being used for the government surveilling on their citizens. Some people are saying the U.S. is becoming a surveillance state, but with the private sector, a few companies using their ability for surveillance to make sure that the state that all this information serves their private interest. Neither system is one that will serve the public interest.
Absolutely, and you have mentioned also the need for a fair taxation of those big multinationals that have many opportunities to erode tax bases and to distribute their profit all around the world, and eventually going to tax havens. No, you also mentioned at the beginning of this conversation the importance of the G20 and their initiative to set a minimum tax for multinationals, which is probably a little bit of light in these days of lack of cooperation and a good step a big step in the right direction. However, it's not only about setting a minimum rate; it's also changing the regulatory framework. No, the common definition of the tax base, which is crucial for many aspects. How do you treat transfer prices? It's not easy. How do you treat royalties? Particularly important in Ireland. Or how do you define who is fiscal resident where? No, which is one of the tricks that are used by multinationals to avoid. And sometimes people mix that with we are talking about using the loopholes of the law. No, and the problem is that I think that fighting these problems internationally is relatively easy. We need, as you say in your book, political will, but it's easy to get rid of isolated tax havens. But what do we do with internal tax havens? What do we do with EU member countries that use an aggressive tax planning? No? The European Commission calls them countries that practice aggressive tax policy benefiting multinationals, to avoid saying they are tax havens within Europe. No? And you see also that in the case of Delaware in the US. Or how do you deal with internal tax havens, given that to combat those practices you need the unanimity that you don't have within, for instance, the European Union?
Well, I would use even stronger terms. I would use predatory tax policies, because what those countries did was to take tax revenues that belong to other countries in Europe, have them booked in Ireland or Luxembourg, allow those companies to pay almost no taxes. So Ireland and Luxembourg got minuscule benefits, and the vast majority of the benefits went to the companies at the expense of their, quote, partners in Europe. So it was, I thought, an outrageous forms of behavior, a lack of solidarity within Europe. The question, of course, is a political one. What do you do about it? And I want to begin, though, with the thinking about how do you think about this issue. When Europe was founded, there was an awareness that the actions of one country could have negative effects on others, externalities. And there was an attempt to circumscribe the extent of those externalities. So there are two sets of regulations about that. One concerns maintaining a level playing field, state aid. You can't compete. You can't engage in unfair trade practices, subsidies that would help your companies at the advantage of others. And that was forbidden. The second was macro policies. There was a fear that if a country had too big of a debt or deficit, it would lead to inflation, not only in their country, but in other countries. That externality turned out not to be true. But they designed a macroeconomic framework that we talked about before, the Growth and Stability Pact, based not on economic science, but on a set of ideologies that was based on this fear of one country imposing macroeconomic harms on others. Turned out not to be important. But you could understand in a period where there was high inflation, there was a worry about that. There's an old expression, you always worry about the wrong problem. And when they founded Europe, they worried about that problem, but they didn't worry about what they should have worried about. What they should have worried about is tax competition, the ability of Ireland or Luxembourg to steal tax revenue from their neighbors. Now, they should have a common framework. And there's a strong support within the European Parliament, for instance, for a common corporate multinational framework. Some of the tax havens are likely to resist. But there are other aspects of the economic framework for Europe where not unanimity is required. The European budget is allocated to different countries for all kinds of things, for common purposes. And it may have to be the case that Europe, the rest of Europe, will have to play, you might call it hardball, with those countries that continue to try to rob their neighbors and say, if you continue to do that, we won't provide you the kinds of economic program benefits that Europe provides to other countries. So I hope that there is greater understanding among the countries within Europe that are these tax havens, that they have to find a cooperative solution. It may entail some forms of assistance to these countries to help them move off of their status as a tax haven and into a more constructive role in Europe. It may take a while, but I have to believe that in the long run, no country can be proud about its business model relying on being a tax haven.
I think I completely agree with you. I think that in the civil society, this is changing. And even though in those countries, the civil society start to think that this is not sustainable anymore. I would like to not to leave the occasion to talk also about the third part of your book, the reform of the welfare state and the how to address the reforms and to guarantee fair labor conditions. You mentioned the correlation between the deterioration of labor conditions and the decrease in the power of trade unions, which is fair and which is totally right and proven by data. But there is also another question I would like to raise. The fact that trade unions are especially active defending the interest of the members, unionized workers, but most of whom have permanent contracts. No? how can we make sure that in today's complex world, the interest of outsiders, to the labor market, the temporary workers, and the unemployed are properly addressed by modern trade unions, especially in Europe, where unemployment is high and duality is so acute?
That's a hard question, and I think as our economies evolve, our politics evolves, my sense is that the trade unions have become increasingly sensitive to precisely the question that you posed. I know that in the United States, many of the unions are now concerned about how do they bring within their ambit workers like the gig economy workers who've been left out of the kind of framework that the traditional union belongs. Home care workers, various kinds of workers who are working in multiple establishments as opposed to one big establishment. And I think the unions have also recognized that they have a role not just in advancing their interest at the workers' interest at the bargaining table, but increasingly the necessity of advancing the interest of workers in the political arena. That the protection of all workers, their workers and workers that they do not represent, there's a kind of solidarity that is needed. And so there has been that transformation from unions, you might say, being insiders versus outsiders, us versus them, to a recognition that the way the politics of the 21st century has to work is it has to be a more inclusive approach that will advance the interest of working people, whether they are members of the union or not.
That's very interesting, and I would like also to address the change not only in the macro landscape that we talked at the beginning, but also the change of scenario in the US politics with the presidency of Joe Biden. Well, clearly President Biden has brought back diplomacy to the political arena, which is wonderful. But at the same time, protectionism was not invented by Trump, and this is something that, and we'll still see the US is increasingly looking inwards, and abandoning the leadership in many areas. The problem is we need, as you clearly say in your book, I totally agree, a huge reform of the multilateral rules-based system. How can this be done without the effective? The EU is clearly the most, probably the biggest supporter of the framework of rules, because that's how the EU was created upon. But the idea is, how can the EU or how can we reform the governance of globalization without an active implication of the EU authorities? Do you think that we can expect from this new administration a spirit of reform, or we will see a constant decline in the WTO system?
First, I think Europe needs more confidence in itself. Europe is, as an economy, as big as the United States. It has more people. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have the military strength, but in some ways, the fact that it doesn't dissipate so much in what I disparagingly say, weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist, means that it has more resources to actually direct itself to the global public good, assistance for those in developing countries, assistance for their own people. So I think Europe needs more confidence. We've seen with the failure in Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam, that military power is not what's going to determine the future. It's soft power. and the soft power of principles, the soft power of democracy, of human rights, of, I would say, even regulations to make sure the social media serves the interests of society. I think that kind of soft power has influence everywhere. So it seems to me that Europe needs to be more assertive of that kind of soft power and recognize that it has that soft power. Now, to some extent, Europe has been moving in that direction as there is effectively now a European foreign minister, somebody that can speak for Europe as a whole. Of course, there are differences among different countries, but there are differences between the blue states and the red states in the United States. And American policy vacillates, so depending on whether you have Trump or Biden as president. The same thing is Europe may even be more steadier in the course that it has with the way its political system. So to me, it seems to me that Europe should be more assertive about what kind of world it thinks would be good to create. And part of that is going to be a world based on multilateralism, a multipolar world where there's not a single ideology. We're going to have to deal for a long time with different ways of organizing societies. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history. Everybody's going to be liberal democracies and free market economies. That looks like a Pollyannish fantasy from the perspective of 30 years on. We're going to have our economic system, and Europe's very similar, our political system based on democracy and human rights. And there'll be other countries that will be non-democratic and authoritarian. We'll have to work together to solve common problems, pandemic and like climate change. But we will be competing for the hearts and minds of those in the third world. I think we believe very strongly that democracy and human rights are important values in their own right and values that actually will uplift the citizens of those countries. So that's where the competition is going to lie. And we have to construct a multilateralism based on that multipolar world, recognizing that there are these differences, but that we have to live together at the same time that we will compete on these fundamental values.
Absolutely right. And you have mentioned climate change and the fight against climate change, and well, the fact is that we are living now new public goods, new externalities, as you said, the global sanitary health, climate fight against climate change, or the environment is a public good. But I just one last question before introducing a couple of questions from the public. You in the book you mentioned climate change. Also, you mentioned the problem of trade globalization that was presented by politicians as a wonderful story with only benefits and no costs. And then governments forgot the losers of globalization, and as a result, we got a backlash against trade, which has elements totally right, but also exaggerations. And energy transition and the fight against climate change has elements of that debate. It remind me of some elements of that debate. Are we forgetting probably that the EU Green Deal and those the fight against climate change has winners and losers, and that disregarding the dynamics of adjustment and the compensation for losers might result in a backlash against energy transition?
Well, I think in all our policies, we have to think carefully about the distributive consequences, that there are winners and losers. There is a difference between globalization and climate change, though. In the case of globalization, we exaggerated the benefits and we ignored the distributive consequences. Mm-hmm. In the case of climate change, we have been underestimating the cost of not taking action. Mm-hmm. We're seeing it already. In the United States, we've been losing 1.5%, 2% of GDP to hurricanes, floods, extreme weather events of one kind and another, fires, and so forth. We are already feeling the consequences. And those consequences already are felt most strongly by the poor, who often live in those areas affected most by climate change. And that's true not only nationally, but globally. Bangladesh, the islands that'll be underwater. So it is imperative that we be sensitive as we design our policies to respond to climate change, that we are sensitive to the distributive effects. But we also have to be mindful of the enormous magnitude and the urgency of taking actions. And if we don't, all of us are going to be hurt.
Who would have thought that we would be talking about inflation after talking about deflation for so
exactly. So I don't think we're going to turn on a dime, but it is something that we have to keep in mind.
Okay, Professor. So we have run out of time. So thank you again for your time, for this wonderful conversation. It has been a pleasure for me and an honor. And I really hope that the European authorities keep your book on their bedside table and go further into the integration process with ambition and improved governance.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real delight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.